Go ahead, the billionaire said with a slow smile, sliding the thick contract across the polished walnut table. Translate every word, or admit you never belonged in this room. The sentence landed harder than the crystal glasses touching together. Conversations dissolved into silence. Even the pianist in the corner seemed to hesitate for a beat before continuing the soft jazz drifting beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Whitmore Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago. Every executive around the private dining room looked toward the young black waitress standing beside the table with a silver water pitcher still resting in her hands. Some exchanged amused glances. Others reached discreetly for their phones beneath the linen-covered table, sensing the beginning of a story worth recording. Ethan Whitmore, 39, founder and CEO of Whitmore Capital, leaned comfortably into his leather chair as though the entire evening belonged to him. In many ways, it did. His investment firm had built skyscrapers, rescued Fortune 500 companies, and controlled deals measured not in millions, but in billions. Investors admired him. Competitors feared him. Employees learned quickly that Ethan enjoyed one thing almost as much as winning: proving other people didn't belong anywhere near his world. Across from him sat representatives from a European technology company preparing to finalize a $620 million acquisition before midnight. Lawyers filled both sides of the table. Financial advisors quietly reviewed folders. Every signature waiting inside those pages could shift markets before sunrise. Yet somehow, the attention of the room no longer rested on the historic deal. It rested on a waitress wearing a perfectly pressed black uniform and a simple silver name tag that read Naomi Brooks. Naomi didn't move. She didn't argue. She didn't force an embarrassed smile the way many service workers learn to do after years of pretending cruel remarks never reach their hearts. Instead, she simply looked down at the contract lying before her. Her expression revealed almost nothing. Calm could be mistaken for uncertainty when people only saw the uniform before they saw the person. Ethan noticed her silence and chuckled softly. "That's what I thought," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "A few legal terms are all it takes." A ripple of restrained laughter moved around the table. It wasn't genuine laughter. It was the careful kind powerful people offer when they're unsure whether disagreeing with the richest man in the room might become expensive. Naomi slowly placed the water pitcher onto a nearby service cart without making a sound. Her hands were steady. Her breathing never changed. Around her, candlelight reflected across crystal glasses and polished marble, while the city skyline shimmered beyond floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Luxury wrapped itself around every inch of the room. Yet beneath the expensive suits and polished smiles, something heavier had begun settling into the air. Nobody realized they were no longer watching a billionaire entertain himself. They were standing at the edge of a moment that would quietly expose who truly understood the value of knowledge, and who had spent far too long confusing wealth with wisdom. Naomi reached for the contract with the same quiet composure she had shown while serving sparkling water only moments earlier. She did not rush to impress anyone, nor did she hesitate long enough to satisfy those waiting for her to fail. She simply opened the first page and allowed her eyes to travel across the carefully printed paragraphs. Around the table, confidence slowly returned to the executives who had assumed the spectacle would end quickly. One attorney folded his arms with a knowing smile. Another investor whispered that the document contained enough legal terminology to confuse most business school graduates. Ethan Whitmore remained perfectly relaxed. He took a slow sip of sparkling mineral water, convinced that every passing second strengthened his point. In his mind, the silence proved that appearances rarely lied. A waitress was simply a waitress. Across the room, however, someone else was paying closer attention. Daniel Mercer, the lead attorney representing the European technology firm, watched Naomi rather than the contract itself. During 3 decades of international negotiations, he had learned that genuine confidence looked very different from forced confidence. People pretending to understand usually spoke too quickly. People who truly understood often became remarkably quiet. Naomi turned another page. Her expression remained unchanged. The candlelight reflected gently across the printed legal language while the skyline beyond the windows shimmered beneath a cool Chicago evening. The city looked peaceful from 40 stories above the streets, but inside the private dining room the atmosphere continued growing heavier with every heartbeat. Several servers paused near the entrance, pretending to organize trays while secretly watching the unfolding scene. They knew Naomi better than anyone at the hotel. She always arrived early, stayed late, and never complained when difficult guests tested her patience. She treated every customer with the same calm respect, whether they ordered a simple cup of coffee or reserved the entire dining room for a multi-million-dollar negotiation. Yet almost nobody asked questions about her life beyond the uniform. Nobody knew why she often carried thick library books during her lunch breaks. Nobody wondered why she occasionally scribbled notes in several different languages before beginning another shift. The guests only saw polished shoes, a pressed apron, and a friendly smile. Ethan leaned forward slightly, unable to resist another remark. "If you need help finding the first sentence, I can ask one of the lawyers to point it out." A few restrained chuckles circled the table once again. Naomi finally lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze for only a brief moment before looking back at the pages. There was no anger in her face, no embarrassment, and certainly no desire for revenge. That quiet restraint unsettled Daniel far more than any argument could have. He noticed something else as well. Naomi was not reading every word. Her eyes moved with deliberate precision, slowing over specific clauses, cross-references, and technical definitions exactly where an experienced legal translator would naturally focus. Daniel's smile disappeared. He glanced toward his own copy of the agreement, then back toward Naomi. For the first time that evening, someone inside the room began to wonder whether the billionaire had misunderstood exactly who was standing beside his table. Naomi closed the folder with careful hands, then opened it again from the beginning as though she wanted to respect every page before speaking a single word. Nobody interrupted her now. The laughter that had filled the room only moments earlier had faded into uncertain silence. Ethan Whitmore noticed the change, but interpreted it differently. He believed the audience was simply waiting for the inevitable embarrassment that would prove his point. He leaned back comfortably, folding one arm across the back of his chair while the skyline of Chicago glowed beyond the towering windows. The city below looked endless, alive with headlights flowing like rivers of white and red beneath the cool spring night. Inside the private dining room, however, time seemed to move more slowly. Naomi's fingertips rested lightly on one paragraph before sliding to another several pages later. Daniel Mercer quietly reached for his own copy once again. His eyes followed the exact sections Naomi had examined. A subtle crease formed across his forehead. Those were not random pages. They contained the cross-border licensing provisions, the intellectual property clauses, and the regulatory language that usually demanded weeks of careful review before agreements of this size could be finalized. Even experienced attorneys occasionally debated the meaning of individual sentences hidden inside those sections. Naomi continued reading without asking a single question. Her breathing remained calm. Her shoulders never stiffened. She looked less like someone facing public humiliation and more like someone organizing information already familiar to her. Across the table, one of the European executives exchanged a puzzled glance with another. Their conversation stopped completely. They had expected confusion. Instead, they found composure. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Well?" he asked with an amused smile. "Surely you have discovered that international contracts are not the same as restaurant menus." His comment drew only a few polite smiles this time. The room no longer responded with the same confidence because uncertainty had quietly entered through a door nobody noticed opening. Naomi lifted her eyes from the pages for only a moment. "May I ask one question before I begin?" she said gently. Ethan gestured toward the contract with theatrical confidence. "Please do." Naomi looked toward both legal teams instead of the billionaire. Which version is considered controlling if there is a conflict between the English text and the German translation? The question settled over the table like a sudden change in weather. Daniel Mercer looked up immediately. One attorney from Whitmore Capital slowly lowered his pen. A partner from the European firm blinked twice before opening the appendix near the back of the agreement. Ethan's confident smile weakened almost imperceptibly. He had expected excuses. He had expected nervousness. He had expected surrender. Instead, the waitress had asked the very first procedural question every experienced international contract specialist would ask before translating a legally binding document. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Several executives instinctively reached for their copies of the agreement, searching for the answer Naomi had not yet revealed. And for the first time that evening, the wealthiest man in the room began to feel something he rarely experienced during negotiations. He realized he was no longer controlling the conversation. Daniel Mercer turned to the final appendix and slowly traced his finger across the governing language clause. His expression changed before he spoke a single word. "The German version controls in the event of any inconsistency," he said quietly. His voice was calm, yet it carried enough weight to erase every remaining smile around the table. Naomi nodded with quiet appreciation, as though the answer merely confirmed something she had already expected. She looked back down at the contract and carefully turned another page. "Thank you," she replied. "That makes the next section much more important." The room had changed without anyone noticing exactly when it happened. A few minutes earlier, every eye had been waiting for a waitress to fail. Now seasoned attorneys, financial advisors, and international executives were waiting for her next sentence. Ethan Whitmore noticed the shift immediately. He had spent his career reading boardrooms, predicting negotiations, and controlling conversations before anyone else recognized where they were heading. Yet this evening had begun slipping beyond his reach. He forced an easy smile and folded his hands together on the polished table. "Very well," he said. "You have everyone's attention. Let us hear your translation." Naomi drew a slow breath before speaking. Her voice remained soft, but every word arrived with remarkable precision. She translated the opening paragraph naturally, preserving not only the legal meaning, but also the subtle commercial intent hidden between the lines. Daniel compared every sentence with the original German text resting before him. His eyebrows lifted slightly after the first paragraph. By the second page, one of the European executives quietly removed his reading glasses and listened instead of reading along. Another attorney stopped making notes altogether. Naomi never rushed. She respected each clause, each definition, each cross-reference exactly as though she had prepared for this meeting herself. There were no dramatic pauses and no attempt to impress anyone. Confidence flowed through knowledge rather than performance. Ethan's relaxed posture slowly disappeared. His fingers tapped once against the armrest before becoming still. He glanced toward his own legal team, expecting someone to interrupt, correct, or challenge the translation. Nobody did. Every attorney remained focused on Naomi. Even the servers standing near the entrance forgot the trays they were holding. The only sounds left inside the private dining room were Naomi's steady voice, the distant piano drifting through the hotel, and the faint hum of Chicago traffic far below the windows. Then Naomi reached a paragraph near the center of the agreement and stopped speaking. She looked at the page for another moment before raising her eyes toward both legal teams. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I believe this provision creates a conflict with the licensing protections described later in the agreement. If interpreted under the controlling language, the ownership rights may not transfer the way everyone at this table expects." No one moved. Daniel Mercer slowly lowered his copy of the contract onto the table. Across from him, another attorney immediately flipped toward the section Naomi had referenced. Ethan no longer looked amused. For the first time that evening, uncertainty appeared behind the confidence that had built his reputation, because the question was no longer whether the waitress could translate the contract. The question had quietly become whether she had just discovered something everyone else had overlooked. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Every attorney at the table began turning pages at nearly the same moment, each searching for the provisions Naomi had connected only seconds earlier. Leather folders opened. Pens stopped moving. The confidence that had filled the private dining room slowly gave way to careful concentration. Daniel Mercer adjusted his glasses and compared the German text against the English draft line by line. He read the disputed paragraph once, then a second time, before flipping several pages ahead to the licensing section Naomi had referenced. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He did not speak immediately because experienced attorneys understood the cost of careless conclusions. Across the table, Whitmore Capital's chief legal counsel repeated the same review with growing concern. Ethan Whitmore watched their reactions instead of the contract itself. He had hired some of the finest corporate lawyers in the country. Their confidence had never failed him before. Yet none of them appeared eager to dismiss what the waitress had just said. Naomi remained exactly where she had been standing from the beginning. She neither defended her observation nor attempted to persuade anyone. She simply waited with quiet patience, allowing the document to speak for itself. Several long seconds passed before Daniel finally looked up. "Would you explain your reasoning?" he asked respectfully. The change in tone did not go unnoticed. Less than 15 minutes earlier, nearly everyone in the room had viewed Naomi as entertainment. Now one of the most accomplished international attorneys at the table was asking for her professional analysis. Naomi nodded politely. The English version suggests that the licensing rights transfer together with the intellectual property after regulatory approval, she said calmly. However, the controlling German language separates those two concepts more narrowly. If interpreted under German commercial law, the ownership transfer may never become complete unless the supplemental licensing agreement is executed first. That document is referenced, but it is not attached to this contract. A quiet murmur spread around the table. One executive from the European company immediately searched through the closing documents stacked beside him. Another attorney reviewed the index twice before slowly shaking his head. The supplemental agreement was listed. It was cited correctly, yet it was missing from the final package. Daniel carefully closed his eyes for a brief moment before reopening the contract. "She is correct," he said with measured certainty. "Without that attachment, there is room for a serious dispute regarding future ownership rights." Nobody celebrated the discovery. Nobody even smiled. The realization carried too much weight. If the agreement had been signed exactly as prepared, years of litigation could have followed, costing both companies extraordinary amounts of money and damaging a partnership built over months of negotiation. Ethan felt the room shifting around him in ways he had never anticipated. The challenge he had intended as harmless amusement had become something entirely different. He looked toward Naomi, searching her face for satisfaction or triumph. He found neither. She simply stood with the same quiet professionalism she had shown while serving water at the beginning of the evening, proving without ever saying it aloud that true knowledge rarely announces itself before it changes everything. No one reached for a pen. The signature pages remained untouched at the end of the table, as though the entire transaction had suddenly frozen in time. Outside the towering windows, Chicago continued moving without interruption, but inside the private dining room, every decision now depended upon a woman whom nobody had expected to hear speak. Daniel Mercer carefully organized the contract, aligning each page with deliberate precision before looking toward the European delegation. "We need to verify every cross-reference before this agreement moves forward," he said calmly. No one argued. The recommendation was accepted immediately. Whitmore Capital's legal team began reviewing the supplemental documentation while another attorney contacted colleagues waiting in a nearby conference room. The atmosphere had completely transformed. Earlier that evening, confidence had filled every conversation. Now humility quietly replaced certainty. Ethan Whitmore remained seated, watching the room operate without his direction for the first time in years. His instincts told him something far more significant than a missing attachment had just occurred. He studied Naomi again, searching for some explanation that matched the image he had formed only minutes before. Nothing about her behavior fit the assumptions he had made. She had not interrupted anyone. She had not tried to prove herself. She had simply recognized a problem because she understood the material. Daniel finally broke the silence once more. "Miss Brooks," he said respectfully, "where did you learn to read legal German?" Every face turned toward Naomi. The question felt natural now. It carried curiosity rather than disbelief. Naomi folded her hands quietly in front of her. "I studied comparative law before my mother became ill," she answered gently. "I focused on international commercial agreements because I enjoyed understanding how different legal systems communicate with one another." Nobody spoke. Her explanation was remarkably simple, almost ordinary, yet it reshaped everything the room believed it had witnessed. She did not mention awards. She did not list achievements. She offered no dramatic story about hidden wealth or secret connections. She simply described a path interrupted by family responsibility rather than ambition. One of the younger associates lowered his eyes, suddenly remembering the joke he had laughed at earlier. Another executive slowly removed the phone he had used to record the beginning of the challenge before quietly placing it back into his pocket. Ethan felt an unfamiliar weight settle across his thoughts. Throughout his career, he had judged people within moments, believing experience had taught him to recognize talent instantly. Tonight, that confidence had failed him completely. Naomi had walked into the room wearing the same uniform she still wore now. Yet the uniform had never changed who she was. Only everyone else's perception had changed. At that moment, an attorney hurried back into the room, carrying another binder. He placed it before Daniel, who opened the missing supplemental licensing agreement and compared it against Naomi's observation. After only a few pages, he slowly nodded. She was exactly right, he said. If this had been signed tonight without this attachment, the ownership structure could have been challenged later. The exposure would have been extraordinary. The words settled over the room with quiet finality. No applause followed. No celebration interrupted the silence. The greatest revelation of the evening was no longer hidden inside the contract. It was hidden inside the assumptions every person at that table had carried into the room. The revised documents were brought into the room within minutes, but nobody seemed eager to rush the process anymore. Every page was examined with the kind of patience that usually appeared only after an expensive mistake had almost happened. The executives who had arrived expecting a routine signing now found themselves witnessing something far more memorable than another successful acquisition. They were watching assumptions collapse one careful observation at a time. Daniel Mercer reviewed the corrected licensing attachment beside the original agreement before slowly closing both folders. He looked toward Naomi with unmistakable respect. You did not simply translate the language, he said. You understood the legal intent behind it. That is a very different skill. Several attorneys around the table quietly nodded. They knew exactly what he meant. Translation required vocabulary. Interpretation required judgment. Naomi had demonstrated both without hesitation. She offered only a modest smile. The document deserved careful reading, she replied. Important agreements usually do. Her answer carried no pride, only quiet professionalism. Ethan Whitmore remained silent. The room had stopped looking to him for direction because everyone understood that the evening had already taken a course no one could have predicted. For the first time in many years, he found himself reflecting before speaking. His eyes settled on the silver name tag that simply read Naomi Brooks. Earlier that evening, it had represented little more than a service position in his mind. Now it reminded him how easily labels could replace genuine understanding. One of Whitmore Capital's senior partners finally broke the silence. Miss Brooks, he asked, why are you working here if you have this background? Naomi answered without hesitation. Because my mother's medical treatments became more important than my graduate tuition. This hotel offered flexible hours, and it allowed me to support my family while continuing to study whenever I could. The simplicity of her explanation filled the room with another long silence. There was no dramatic confession, no hidden fortune, no secret identity waiting to surprise everyone. Only sacrifice, responsibility, and quiet determination. Several people lowered their eyes, realizing how confidently they had mistaken circumstance for ability. Ethan slowly stood from his chair. No one interrupted him. He walked around the polished conference table until he stopped a respectful distance from Naomi. The movement alone surprised everyone present. Throughout his career, people usually approached Ethan. He rarely approached anyone else. He looked directly at Naomi before speaking with a sincerity absent from his earlier remarks. I owe you an apology, he said calmly. I judged your profession before I recognized your knowledge. More importantly, I judged your value before taking the time to understand your character. Had you remained silent tonight, this company might have paid an extraordinary price for my arrogance. The room remained completely still. Nobody expected the billionaire to admit fault so openly. Naomi met his eyes with the same composed expression she had carried all evening. Everyone makes assumptions, she answered gently. The important part is deciding what we learn after they are proven wrong. Ethan nodded slowly. Her words carried no accusation. They offered something much rarer than victory. They offered grace. In that quiet moment, every executive, attorney, and employee inside the private dining room understood that the most valuable lesson of the evening had never been hidden inside a $620 million contract. It had been hidden inside a person almost everyone had overlooked. The corrected agreement was finalized only after every attorney confirmed that the missing attachment had been properly incorporated into the transaction. One by one, The legal teams placed their signatures on the updated documents with a level of care that had been missing earlier in the evening. The acquisition moved forward, but everyone understood it had taken a very different path than anyone had expected. What should have been remembered as another successful business deal had become a lesson that would remain with every person in the room long after the ink had dried. As assistants gathered the signed folders and servers quietly refreshed coffee cups, conversations resumed in softer voices. The confidence that had once sounded like certainty had been replaced by genuine respect. Daniel Mercer approached Naomi before preparing to leave. He extended his hand with the courtesy usually reserved for trusted colleagues. "I have negotiated international agreements for more than 30 years, he said. "Very few people recognize legal inconsistencies as quickly as you did tonight. Your attention to detail protected both sides of this transaction." Naomi accepted the handshake with quiet humility. "I am glad the agreement was corrected before anyone signed the wrong version," she replied. "That is what matters most." Her answer reflected the same character she had demonstrated from the beginning. She never searched for recognition. She simply valued doing the right thing. Nearby, several younger associates who had quietly laughed when Ethan first challenged her now exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them finally walked over. "Miss Brooks," he said sincerely, "I owe you an apology as well. I assumed you could not understand the discussion because of your job. I was wrong." Naomi smiled kindly. "We all have opportunities to learn," she answered. "The important thing is recognizing them when they arrive." Her response carried no bitterness. It offered everyone in the room permission to grow instead of remaining trapped by embarrassment. Ethan watched the exchange from several feet away. He realized that influence was not measured only by financial success or executive authority. In less than an hour, Naomi had changed the atmosphere of an entire boardroom without raising her voice, demanding recognition, or reminding anyone of their mistakes. She had simply allowed truth and competence to speak for themselves. Before the guests departed, Ethan addressed both legal teams and the executives from the European company. "Tonight reminded me of something every leader should remember," he said. "Talent does not always arrive wearing an expensive suit or sitting at the head of the table. Sometimes it is standing quietly beside you while you are too distracted by appearances to notice." Several people nodded in thoughtful agreement. No one questioned his words because everyone present had witnessed the same transformation. As the elevators carried the guests toward the lobby and the lights inside the private dining room gradually dimmed, Naomi returned to collecting empty glasses and neatly arranging the service carts. She performed the ordinary tasks with the same care she had given the extraordinary ones. To anyone passing by the hallway, she looked like a waitress finishing another evening shift. Only the people who had shared that room understood they had just watched someone preserve a $620 million agreement through knowledge, patience, and quiet integrity, proving once again that true greatness rarely announces itself before it changes the lives of everyone willing to see it. The following Monday morning, sunlight poured through the glass walls of Whitmore Capital headquarters as employees hurried through another busy workday, unaware that one decision made over the weekend would quietly redefine the company's culture. Ethan Whitmore entered the executive boardroom, carrying something far less ordinary than another acquisition report. Resting inside a simple leather folder was a new initiative that would require every hiring manager, executive, and department leader to complete blind candidate evaluations before reviewing names, photographs, or employment backgrounds. The policy was straightforward. Every applicant would first be judged by demonstrated ability instead of assumptions. During the meeting, several board members asked what had inspired the unexpected change. Ethan paused for a moment before answering. "Because I nearly overlooked the most qualified person in the room simply because I believed I already understood who she was." No one challenged the proposal. By the end of the meeting, it passed unanimously. Later that afternoon, Ethan visited the hotel once more, not as a customer seeking another private dinner, but as someone determined to finish a conversation the right way. Naomi Brooks was arranging fresh place settings before the evening guests arrived when she noticed him waiting respectfully near the entrance instead of expecting immediate attention. Ethan greeted her with a warm smile. "I came to thank you again," he said, "not only for protecting an important agreement, but for teaching me something I should have learned long ago." He handed her a sealed envelope. Inside was an offer to join Whitmore Capital as an international legal consultant, along with a scholarship that would fully cover the completion of her graduate studies regardless of whether she accepted the position. Naomi read the letter carefully before looking back at Ethan. She appreciated the generosity, but what mattered most to her was not the salary or the title. It was the respect behind the offer. She smiled warmly. "I would like to finish my degree first," she said. "Knowledge deserves patience, just like opportunity." Ethan nodded without disappointment. "The offer will remain open," he replied. "Whenever you are ready, the door will still be here." They shook hands as equals before Ethan quietly left the hotel. Months later, stories about the remarkable evening continued circulating among attorneys, executives, and hotel staff who had witnessed the unexpected turn of events. Some remembered the contract. Others remembered the apology. But nearly everyone remembered the moment an entire room stopped seeing a uniform and finally started seeing the person wearing it. Naomi completed another evening shift exactly as she had before, greeting every guest with the same kindness and professionalism that had always defined her character. She never sought attention for what had happened because she understood that true confidence did not depend upon public recognition. It lived quietly inside preparation, integrity, and humility. And somewhere beyond the skyline of Chicago, another business deal was already being negotiated, another boardroom was already filling with confident voices, and another opportunity was waiting to remind someone that appearances can introduce a person, but character and knowledge are what ultimately define them. Because power may open a door, but respect is what allows people to walk through it together, and the greatest victories are not won by proving someone else wrong, but by choosing to see the worth that was there all along.